Today on Sugar Spun Run, I'll be showing you how to make my favorite tomato soup. Hey Sugar Spun Bakers, Sam here, and today I am so excited to be sharing another carefully tested, well-researched, and perfected recipe. This tomato soup was so carefully developed. I wanted it to be rich and creamy and velvety smooth, but still have a lot of that incredible tomato flavor without being too acidic. I think you are going to absolutely love this one, so let's go ahead and jump right in. Now, before we head over to the stovetop, let's talk about prepping a couple of our ingredients. For today's recipe, you're going to need 2 medium-sized onions. Sweet onions or yellow onions, either would be a great choice for today's recipe. We're going to want to cut these and we're going to finely chop them. I like to chop my pieces pretty small and I want to keep them pretty uniform in size so they cook evenly, but you don't need to worry about making them too tiny because we're going to ultimately be pureeing all of our ingredients, so they're going to get all blended up anyway. All right, so once you have all your onions prepped, we can set those aside and let's move on to our garlic. For today's recipe, you're going to need a heaping tablespoon of freshly minced garlic. For me, this is usually 3 to 5 cloves. We'll just chop off the edges and remove that papery shell. You don't want that. And if that ever gives you any trouble, you can sometimes just kind of gently smash the garlic and the shell usually breaks off once you do that. Easiest way to mince garlic, if you haven't before, is to grab a large knife and you just kind of go in a rocking motion. I don't know if you can really see that. This is the motion I'm doing on the garlic. And I just collect the garlic together and then I just rock over it with my knife until it's finely minced. Make sure you keep your fingers out of there. Okay, let's make sure I have a nice tablespoon of that and we'll set that aside as well. And finally, you're going to need 1/4 cup of fresh basil. Now you're going to want to finely slice this. I have a whole bunch of fresh basil leaves here, and the easiest way to slice them and to do it quickly is just to kind of stack them on top of each other. Just gently roll them, and then use a sharp knife to make quick, fine slices. All right, we'll set this aside as well, and we'll use all of these in just a little bit, but now we can head over to our stovetop. Now, before we begin, I do want to talk a little bit about the pot that we're going to be using. An enameled cast iron pan is a great choice, but you do not want to use a regular cast iron or iron pot. Now, because we're making a tomato soup, as you know, tomatoes are very acidic and they can end up reacting with the iron pot and they can make the soup just taste awful. It's going to taste super metallic no matter what you do. An enameled pan is a great choice because that enamel is going to keep the tomatoes from direct contact with the cast iron. It's going to keep you from getting a really bad flavor. Stainless steel would also work well here. That would be fine as well. Now to this pot, we're going to add 4 tablespoons of unsalted butter and turn your stovetop heat to medium, and we're just going to let that butter melt. Once it's melted, go ahead and add your onions, and we're going to cook the onions, stirring pretty frequently with a spatula until they're nice and translucent, and this usually takes about 5 minutes or so. Once your onions are nice and translucent, we can go ahead and add our garlic. We're just going to stir that in and cook it until it's fragrant, which is usually about 30 seconds. All right, because I like my tomato soup to be nice and velvety and smooth, I like to add about 1.5 tablespoons of all-purpose flour. I'll just sprinkle that over top, and I'll use my spatula to make sure I get it nicely worked in with the other ingredients, so you don't want to have any flour clumps in there. Now you'll want to cook this flour for about 60 seconds. You want it to get nice and toasted. And then once it is, you're going to want to grab your tomatoes and add those to the pot. Now this is 2 28-ounce cans of tomatoes, and we are using whole peeled tomatoes. I'm going to talk about these more in just a second, but this is kind of a pressing task, so let me get the tomatoes added first. All right, let me give this a quick stir, and let's take a second to talk tomatoes before we go any further. You are going to need 2 28-ounce cans of whole peeled tomatoes. San Marzano are a great choice. Sometimes I can only find them with basil and salt added. If you can, that's fine. This soup is really forgiving. If yours doesn't have basil and salt, that's fine too. Ultimately, you're going to be doing a little bit of taste testing for the salt anyway, so it's not a big deal either way. However, you do want to use whole peeled tomatoes, and you're not going to drain them or anything. You're going to add them right into the pot. Now, I know some people are going to be like, well, why aren't we using fresh tomatoes? And First of all, this time of year that I'm making this video, there are not a lot of really good fresh tomatoes available. Second, even if you're growing them in your garden yourself, it's really hard to control the flavor and get consistent results every time. If you use canned tomatoes, you are pretty much guaranteed to get a really robust flavor that's really consistent. It's going to give you a really good tomato flavor that I cannot guarantee if you're using fresh tomatoes. Even if you are using fresh tomatoes, you're going to have to put them through a process first, a cooking process, in order to get the flavor that you really want. So for consistency's sake and for best results, I am recommending canned tomatoes, and I stand by that pretty firmly. Now, back to the soup. Since these are whole tomatoes, we are going to want to go ahead and crush them pretty quickly. We want to get all of those tomatoes nicely broken up. If you wanted, you could crush the tomatoes by hand before adding them to the pot. I don't really find that to be necessary. I think just going through with my spatula, or if you wanted to be really thorough, a potato masher, that works just fine. We'll also add our basil from earlier. We're going to be adding 2 tablespoons of granulated sugar. This is going to help a lot with the acidity of the tomatoes, a half teaspoon of ground black pepper, and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. We're gonna get that really well stirred together. The next thing that we'll need is 2 cups of low sodium chicken broth, and we will go ahead and pour this into our soup and stir it in so it's nicely combined. All right, stir your soup really well, and we're going to let it come to a boil. Once it comes to a boil, you can reduce the heat, and we're going to let it simmer for about 20 minutes before we go any further. All right, at this point, if you have an immersion blender, grab it. If you don't, you're going to want to buy one because these things are amazing. But for the time being, if you don't have one, you can puree the soup in batches in a blender instead. Now, I have an immersion blender, so I'm going to use this to puree my soup until everything is well pureed and my soup is nice and smooth. I will make sure I leave a link in the description so you can get yourself one of these immersion blenders because it really is such a time saver and I love it. Okay, this is completely smooth, so now I like to add 1/3 cup of heavy cream. This makes for a nice, creamy, rich soup. It's not too rich. The tomatoes do a good job of ensuring that that's not the case, but it has such a nice, deep flavor. I love it. Now, I'm just going to take a little bit of that soup and put it in a separate dish, just because I want it to cool a little bit because I can't eat it right out of the pot. And we'll do a quick taste test. So, I still feel, and every time I've made this soup I feel this way, I feel at this point that the tomato taste is still a little bit too strong and too acidic. So my favorite secret trick to make a really good soup is at this point I like to add 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. This may seem like a strange ingredient to add to tomato soup, but it really cuts down on the acidity. It balances the flavors without totally bullying the tomato flavor at all. It just makes for a really good tomato soup. Now we're just going to gently stir this in, and you're going to notice the soup is doing a little bit of foaming. That's totally normal. Just keep gently stirring until the foaming stops and you have a nice smooth soup again. All right, so we'll taste test again. And it really makes all the difference in the world. Like I said, I know you may seem skeptical, which is why I add the baking soda at the end so you can decide for yourself if you want to use it or not, but it just makes such a difference in the soup and such a good difference. Now, if you feel like you need to, you can add a little bit more salt or a little bit more pepper to the soup at this point. I really recommend topping the soup with Parmesan cheese when you serve it, and that adds a little bit of salt. So typically I don't need to add much more, if any. That's just something to keep in mind. All right, let's go ahead and serve this. And Parmesan cheese is just really non-negotiable with this recipe. It's so good. And that is how you make my favorite tomato soup in the whole world. I cannot wait for you to try this one. I think you are just going to love the flavor. And when you try it, please leave me a comment and let me know what you think. I always love hearing from you. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. So good.